Testing, testing, testing. Hello, hello.
Hi.
That's great. That sounds good.
Okay, I'll go ahead and kick it off then. Thank you very much. It's wonderful to see everybody here on this cold night. And it's great to see that everybody made it on what's now called the Route 1 dead end. Struggling with the state of Illinois Department of Transportation for a little while this summer. So hopefully it'll get open soon, but thank you for making it. My name is Mike Wader. I'm one of the directors of the Crete Area Historical Society. We're co-sponsoring this event with the Crete Public Library, who donated this room and this facility for us, so which is very much appreciated. So we're thrilled tonight to welcome Dr. Larry McLellan to talk about stories about the Underground Railroad and talk about some of the things in his new book. Anybody that doesn't know, there's nobody in this room that doesn't know, but Dr. McLellan is obviously an expert on the Underground Railroad, especially in the south suburbs of Chicago. So. And based on the technical stuff that I see set up here, I think there's going to be a little treat in the middle of it, maybe. So yeah. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. McLellan.
Great, thank you. And one of my colleague Al Mack has provided the PA, and he's going to be singing a song or two for us this evening. And I'm discovered, oh yeah, having the mic is a good idea because then I don't have to project for an hour, and you can all hear me just fine back there?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, that's terrific, that's terrific. Well, delighted to be here. And part of the occasion is that in September, Southern Illinois University Press published what is kind of my final book on the Underground Railroad, and we've been just really very pleased with the response that the book has received. And in September and October, I had a whole bunch of book signings and programs, and got kind of worn out. But we had about a month without doing much, and so I'm glad to be with you tonight. And helping me to sell the books is my lovely assistant, Lil, my wife, is here, and she will be selling the books. The Onward to Chicago book is, I'll do a little commercial. The Onward to Chicago book is $25. My book on the Underground Railroad south of Chicago, which has a lot of details about Crete, is $22. And then the book about Caroline Quarles, who has a very unique story related to Crete, as you'll be discovering tonight. That book is $18. So if you are moved, we can take cash or checks or Venmo or Zelle or Zettel, for credit cards. So we can take your money. I'm really, I've been at this for about 25 years. And if you will forgive me for being immodest, we were very surprised in September. I was informed by the Underground Railroad Free Press. They got in touch with me. The Underground Railroad Free Press is the online newsletter for all of us involved with the Underground Railroad around the country. There are about 26,000 people in their subscription list. And in September, the Underground Railroad Free Press awarded me their 2023 prize for the advancement of knowledge about the Underground Railroad, and they called my book, and again, forgive me, but I need to share it. They called my book, this book is the finest book yet written about the actual workings of the Underground Railroad. Yeah. Needless to say, I was pretty stunned, but grateful for that affirmation. And and several other things like that are starting to happen. I've been invited to a couple lecture series and so on. So it's getting kind of, wow, this is pretty, exciting after toiling in obscurity for 20 years. So what I'd like to do tonight is share with you some introductory thoughts, how to understand the Underground Railroad, how do we think about it right here in our own backyards, and then I want to tell you some stories. about freedom seekers. And so as we get ourselves rolling in that direction, I've asked Al. Al Mack is a resident of Crete, a member of the Crete Area Historical Society, and very experienced and broadly based musician, and is becoming a new friend and colleague. And I asked him if he would kind of set the stage for us with a great historic music out of the African American tradition. And then when we get toward the end of things, I'm going to ask him to sing another. So here we go.
All right.
Glad you're here.
When Israel was in Egypt's land, let my people go. Oppressed so hard they could not stand, let my people go. Go down, Moses, wait out in Egypt's land. Tell old Pharaoh to let my people go. Thus speak the Lord, but Moses said, let my people go. If not, I'll smite your firstborn dead. Let my people go. Go down, Moses, wait out in Egypt's land. Tell old Pharaoh to let my people go. No more shall they in bondage toil. Let my people go. Let them come out with Egypt spoiled. Let my people go. Go down, Moses, wait out in Egypt's land. Tell old Pharaoh to let my people go.
Yes. There are two great cycles of stories having to do with the Underground Railroad. One is about the freedom seekers, those people who were enslaved in the South and found through whatever means possible the ways to find their freedom. And one of the reasons I wanted Al to sing that song was that to reinforce that fundamental understanding of that press for freedom, that drive for freedom, that the people will be let go, that the people will be free. And there's another set of stories about the people that responded to it, the people that helped, what we call the responses of the Underground Railroad. Now, the dilemma we have in American society and in our history is that for the last 180 years, we've told an awful lot of stories about the Underground Railroad, and we haven't told very many stories about the freedom seekers. And part of what I'm committed to, and there are a lot of people around the country who are now working on this, is how do we reframe this conversation so that we affirm that the stories of the people seeking their freedom are really at the heart of all this. And there were lots of wonderful people that responded, but if we talk only about the Underground Railroad and not about the people that were on their journey to freedom, we miss an awful lot. And so from the very beginning, we need to affirm that fundamental understanding. The people had to be free. Let my people go. And so we need to tell both cycles of stories so that we get it right. And what we're doing is we're really reframing this whole conversation. Now you've noticed that I've used the expression freedom seeker. And that's very deliberate because in the 19th century and the 20th century, we were talking about fugitive slaves. And those were the people who, by the language of the 19th century and by the laws of the 19th century, those were the people who had escaped. They were fugitives. But fugitive slave is a category of property and a category of ownership. And we must understand that these were human beings who were committed to freedom for themselves and their families. And so we very deliberately, when we are talking about freedom seekers, referring to them as freedom seekers to affirm their human intention as human beings enslaved against their will and desiring above all else to be free. And so part of the reframing is, yes, they were known as as fugitive slaves, but we will refer to them as freedom seekers because of their intention as human beings to be free people. Now the second piece of it that's very important as we reframe this is that over the last 160 years, the image has developed that a bunch of good abolitionists, white abolitionists and a few black abolitionists, created the Underground Railroad and then invited the slaves to come up and get to freedom. And that's simply not what happened. What we need to remember, and we need to reframe it so we understand that freedom seekers, as individuals, as families, as small groups, by whatever means necessary, headed for their freedom, and other people responded to them. And it was the responses that became the networks of the Underground Railroad. And so, as a colleague of mine says, the Underground Railroad did not foster the movement of freedom seekers. The Underground Railroad was created in response to the movement of freedom seekers. And that's another key piece of that reframing. Al, I'm doing something weird. Are you hearing this? There's a buzz.
Oh, maybe it's picking up the sound.
You know what? I can do. There you go. You still hear me?
Yeah.
Super. Okay, great. Thank you, sir. All right. Another part of that reframing is also to see that this was a process in which lots of people were engaged. Part of the dilemma of 19th century history is it always talks about the men. And I like to say that it's the problem we've got with the Underground Railroad and a lot of American history is that it was written by old white men who were writing about old white men. And the story is a lot richer than that. And that in fact, the people involved in responding to freedom seekers were men and women, were white and black, were young and old. And if you think about it, if somebody comes to your farm and knocks on the door, for a family to respond, that had to be a family decision. I can just imagine husbands and wives sitting down at a table at night and saying, are we willing to break the law to help these folks that have shown up? And that's a decision not made by men, but made by husbands and wives and families together to be of assistance. And so the people involved were an incredibly diverse group. And in addition, a lot of that diversity had to do with race. Across the United States, there were a significant number of black families that were involved in responding to freedom seekers. It wasn't just good white abolitionists, there were a lot of good black abolitionists that were also in that response. And then finally, to understand that at least when I grew up, and you may have had the same experience, I always thought the Underground Railroad was something that happened on the East Coast. You know, Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass and all of that. And good Lord, every February, every student in Illinois hears about Harriet Tubman. Well, God bless Harriet Tubman, but there are thousands of people who were freedom seekers in Illinois, and it's time we're telling their stories too. So part of what I'm trying to do with the book and what others around the country are trying to do is how do we reframe this whole conversation so that we understand that to talk about the Underground Railroad is to talk about freedom seekers and the people that responded, to talk about a nationwide experience, and to talk about an experience that involved an incredibly diverse group of people. So I invite you to join into and maybe help change your mind a bit on some of those things. Now, what I like to do is do the bottom fell off. Mm-hmm. I've had that happen. There you go, thank you. What I'd like to do is kind of share a variety of perspectives on the Underground Railroad and some of our local connections, and then tell you some stories. First of all, always, we never forget that this all begins with the brutal reality of slavery. And that the reason that people sought their freedom was because of how incredibly destructive this was for human beings. 12 million people were captured, kidnapped in Africa, brought across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas. About 400,000 of those came to what we know as the United States. And they came here against their will, in absolutely incredibly barbaric conditions, and then became property. And I think we as human beings today, it's very difficult for us to even begin to understand what does it mean that some people literally owned other people. When I do my research prior to 1850, I'm not looking at population records. I'm looking at property records. And I'm looking at estate sales and tax records. And there with the horses and the pigs and the sheep are the slaves. All right, this is almost impossible to understand the power and the brutality of this, but that is what people seeking their freedom were responding to. We need to make sure we understand that in very deep ways. Now, when people wanted to escape, where did they go? They went in all kinds of directions. I've added these blue arrows. They went to Mexico. They went west to live with native peoples. They went to the Caribbean. Some people commandeered ships and took their ships to New England. The vast majority came into the northern states, which were free. This map from 1850, the dark states are the slave states, and do remember that Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware never seceded. They were not part of the Confederacy, but they were slave states. And part of the complexity of the Civil War was that Lincoln was president over a union of free and slave states. And for people living in Illinois, the vast majority of people who came into the state as freedom seekers came out of Missouri and Kentucky. And can you imagine being enslaved and walking to the Mississippi River and looking across at Illinois and knowing that that was freedom? The vast majority of folks that end up, freedom seekers that end up coming to Chicago, into our area, were from Missouri. The other thing that's interesting about the map is also to recognize that Southern Illinois and Cairo are further south than most of the state of Virginia. Part of our unique history as Illinois has been the dynamic between Southern Illinois and Northern Illinois. And Southern Illinois was deeply, deeply Southern. As a matter of fact, just before the Civil War, there was a county in Southern Illinois that seceded from Illinois. They were going to join the Confederacy. And however, it was in the middle of southern Illinois, and the federal troops showed up and they thought better of it. And the county board changed their mind and they decided they would not try to secede from Illinois. My research shows that somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 people came into Illinois seeking freedom. And that at least 3,000 of those made their way into the Chicago, northeastern Illinois area. And you'll see with my arrows that a lot of them came up the Mississippi River Valley. And Mike, could I get a cup of water?
Right underneath there for you.
Thank you, Mike.
Sarah was thinking of you.
Now that's service, excuse me. When I was teaching, I could go for 3 hours without a drop, but now can't do that. So then, coming up the Mississippi River Valley, coming out of Missouri and Kentucky, coming up the Illinois River Valley, up into northeastern Illinois. Now, as I've been doing this research, and with some of the work that I'll talk about in a few minutes, I've been very involved with people in Indiana and discovering that there is a whole different pattern of movement coming up through Indiana, also heading to Detroit and freedom in Canada. And that's a lecture for another day. My focus has been on both Illinois and also northwest Indiana. And there were basically two streams of movement for freedom seekers. There were a large number that came up through Illinois and headed directly towards Chicago. And then from Chicago, they either went by lake or around by land on their way to Detroit and then freedom in Canada. However, a significant number made it into the Chicago area but chose not to go to the city. And they bypassed Chicago, and our Crete, Will County stories are very much a part of that second pattern of movement. Now, across northeastern Illinois, I've identified about 60 places where we have very good evidence that freedom seekers were here. And every time I tell this story, there are people that say, oh, I didn't know that happened here. And it is stunning. Wherever I go, I've got freedom seeker stories, and wherever I go, people don't know it. And I think it is, in its own way, a reflection of the fact that, the blunt reality is that we have done a very good job of ignoring most of Black history in this country. And we need to understand that Black history matters because it's all of our history. It's history for all of us. And understanding these parts of our history enriches and enlarges our understanding of our entire national history. But it is very interesting that of those 60 places, only a very few have been researched and in any way recognized as Underground Railroad sites. There were very, very strong networks in Chicago. And if some of you want to invite me to your house sometime, I could spend 3 hours and tell you about Chicago and the Underground Railroad, but I'll do it in 2 minutes now. But the stories are absolutely incredible. The traditional story says that a small group of white guys started the Underground Railroad in 1839, and that they were taking care of these poor fugitives, and that's simply not the case. We know that there were Black families in Chicago from the early 1830s, and from the very beginning, Black families in Chicago were assisting freedom seekers that were coming through Chicago in the 1830s. Among them was an absolutely remarkable guy named Louis Isbell, who was enslaved in Kentucky, got his freedom, moved to Chicago in 1838, and was deeply involved in assisting freedom seekers. And of course, you all know Louis Isbell, right?
No.
Oh, really? Wow. Probably one of the most remarkable Chicagoans in the history of our state. And of course, nobody knows who he is. I have a standing offer. If anybody will write a book about him,
Louis Isbell, I'll help them. This is an absolutely remarkable guy. He came here in 1838 and he was involved in the leadership of every significant thing that happened in the black community for 70 years. And nobody knows about it. Died in 1905. Just a remarkable guy. I've got some very great, a couple slightly off color, but some really great stories about Louis Isbell, a guy who was born enslaved and understood deeply in his bones what it meant to be a free human being. So black families were helping freedom seekers throughout the 1830s. Then, interestingly, in the late 1830s, a group of young white families settled in Chicago because it was the new boomtown. They had come out of New York and New England, and they were vaguely anti-slavery. But they started running into these freedom seekers coming to Chicago, and they realized they had to respond, and they really created the beginnings of the underground networks in the city of Chicago. Now, let me remind you that in the decades before the Civil War, a lot of people in the North were more or less anti-slavery. Now, slavery's a bad thing. But that's about as far as it went. Now, who has a cell phone? No, it's all about cell phones, okay. It is very likely that some elements in your cell phone are the result of being produced by people in slave-like conditions in Western China. That's awful. That's awful. Do you care? Yes. Well, kind of. But think of anti-slavery like that. You know, Western China's a long way away, and yes, that's a bad thing, but are you doing anything about it now? Most of the people in the North, it was like that. Mississippi was a long way away. You know, Lord, it'd take you a month to get to Mississippi. All right? So bear in mind, people were anti-slavery, but it was that kind of, oh yeah, that's a bad thing. Now, across the North, there were a handful of people that said, this is really serious. We have got to do something about it. We have to get rid of slavery. We have to abolish it. Those were the abolitionists, and they were a very small number. Then, among the abolitionists, there were a handful of people that said, this is so serious, and I've had people on my porch that needed help, and we have decided that our family is going to break the law to help. That's the Underground Railroad, right? So, across the North, loads of people, yeah, slavery's bad. A very small number said, we will become abolitionists to abolish this thing. And then among the abolitionists, a tiny number said, we will break the law. That's the Underground Railroad that develops in response to the fact that human beings traveling out of the South showed up on their doorsteps, and they had to respond. Okay, so those young white families began to respond and decide they would break the law to be of help. Then, in the mid-1840s, a group, and again, it's fascinating, 44 to 47, this group of young black families settled in Chicago. Chicago was seen as kind of a free place for people of color. They settle in Chicago, and they immediately get involved in responding to freedom seekers. And part of what happens by the time we get into the 1850s, remember the Civil War starts in 1861. By the time we get into the 1850s, these young white families and young black families start to get acquainted with each other and start developing some real friendships as they start responding to the needs of freedom seekers that are coming through the region. And I really think that part of what we all need to do is think about this set of activities. The first great civil rights movement in Northern Illinois was the fact that white families and black families worked together to be responsive to people that were on their way to freedom. And it's a remarkable part of our history that, again, is not well known. Okay, now, lots and lots of stories about Chicago, but I want to focus for a few minutes on the south suburbs and realize that Chicago was basically the size of the Loop, okay? In the 40s and 50s, 30, 45,000 people, basically the size of the Loop. So for people that made it to Chicago but wanted to get to freedom in Canada, they had to come south 15 miles on what was known as the historic Detroit to Chicago Road, which had been established in 1825. And so they came across through farmland and open prairie, and they came to two areas where there were Dutch settlers. A group of Dutch folk came to Illinois in the late 1840s, and they settled in what we know as Roseland and what we know as South Holland. And it turns out that the upper blue circle is Roseland and the lower is South Holland, that the great road to Detroit passed right through those communities. There were two families among the Dutch that spoke English. The family of Cornelius and Marte Kuiper, and the family of Jan and Angie Tun. And the Tuns established a farm right on the Little Calumet River, and the Kuipers lived on the Chicago Road right about there. And these two families, the Kuipers and the Tuns, got directly involved with assisting freedom seekers, and the Tun farm became a location for freedom seekers to settle. And over the last, really over the last 20 years, particularly the last 5 years, we have done a lot of work to see that this now has been recognized as a nationally designated site on the movement of the Underground Railroad because of what we know about freedom seekers coming and visiting with these Dutch, staying with these Dutch farmers. The Tun farm was right overlooking the river, and we've got a whole cycle of stories about freedom seekers coming through and relating to the Dutch folk. Last year, in September of 2022, we dedicated this marker, state historic marker, for freedom seekers and the Underground Railroad at the site of the Tun farm. We had a giant celebration. That's Lieutenant Governor Juliana Stratton. Ron Gaines owns the marina where this is located. There's our Congresswoman Robin Kelly, Cook County Commissioner Donna Miller. That's my colleague Tom Shepard. And in the background is he's the Consul General for the Kingdom of the Netherlands in Chicago. And he was very excited that we were celebrating Dutch immigrants helping freedom seekers. This is located on the grounds of the Chicago's finest marina, which in itself is a historic place. It's the only black-owned marina in the Chicago region. And this site has been designated as part of the National Park Service Network to Freedom. So this is an official National Park Service designated place. Now, so we know that people came down through on the Chicago-Detroit Road on the way to Canada, but we also know that a lot of people bypassed Chicago. They got up into Ottawa, into Joliet, into Shanahan, and they looked for the Sauk Trail corridor. The Sauk Trail is a native trail that is 300 or 400 years old, and this is the only picture we have from 1921 of the trail, but you can see, although it's a pretty bad picture, but you can see the way the real trek just kind of was developed over hundreds of years of native peoples moving back and forth. The Sauk Trail reaches from the Mississippi River to Detroit. And as freedom seekers came up into our region, they found the Sauk Trail corridor, and they headed east because they knew that would take them to Detroit and freedom in Canada. And yes, it's the Sauk Trail that's like 2 miles. That's north, right? Am I pointing?
Yes.
That's north, okay. 2 miles north, it's right there. And so the story starts to come pretty close to home. We know of a number of places. There was a family in a tavern in New Lenox, the Haven family. There were people in Joliet. There were families in Homer Township and in Mokina. this Deacon Reuben Beach and his family, some of his relatives were in Homer Township, and then some of the relatives end up here in Crete. And then an interesting family, and most of these people are from New York and New England. Getting even closer to home, at the corner of Western Avenue and Sauk Trail, there's that little house, right? Well, in fact, that corner used to be the home of the Batchelder family, and they were deeply involved in assisting freedom seekers that came across. And they worked very closely with their neighbors who were John and Sabra McCoy. This is one of the very few photographs we have, but this is a guardrail. This is from about 1910. This is a guardrail on the Sauk Trail, and immediately on the other side is the home of John and Sabra McCoy. And the Genslers are not here. No? No, okay. Here in Crete, and very active in the Historical Society, are Ed and Harriet Gensler. Harriet is a McCoy, and I've had spent many hours with Harriet and with Ed, and from them I got a copy of this picture. And again, you can see the McCoy homestead. There's the Sauk Trail right there. And in Ed and Harriet's house is this painting, again, of the McCoy homestead on the Sauk Trail. And, you know, right here, the records suggest that we know of at least 90 freedom seekers that received some kind of support from the McCoys as they traveled across on the Sauk Trail. That is John McCoy as a young man, and Sabra McCoy as an older person. But, you know, very much kind of frontier people, right? And if you are, do a little trip with me in your mind. Okay, you're on Sauk Trail at Western Avenue, and you're driving east, okay? You go about a quarter mile, and it goes across. There's a tiny little bridge across Thorn Creek, and just after you cross Thorn Creek, on the north side of the street is this. And in fact, that shelf of land was the location of the McCoy homestead. Right there, all right? So the dilemma is you have to go 45 on Sauk Trail. You can't stop. So, you know, don't do this by yourself, but with other people, go and put your blinkers on, slow down a little bit, and particularly in the winter, you can really see it. But look to the north side, and you'll see that the creek is just, 100 feet that way. So you'll see that little shelf of land, and that's literally in our backyards where we know that a whole bunch of freedom seekers, probably on this trail, probably 500 to 800 freedom seekers walked the way to freedom right through our backyards. Okay?
Oh my gosh.
All right, now, if you go a little further on the south side of the Sauk Trail, you'll see this monument. There's a little stone marker in the back, and it says on it, you can't read it, site of Indian and Pioneer Campground, dedicated by the Sauk Trail chapter of the DAR in like 1936 or something like that. Well, that's not what originally was here. What originally was there was this plaque. Now, the plaque is now owned and is in the possession of the Moni Historical Society, but it was a plaque that was established in 1936, and then it was immediately stolen. But it was established in honor of the first pioneer settlers, and so you've got Adam Brown, and there's John McCoy, and there's Lorenzo, and Timothy, and Samuel, and Frederick. All these guys just did it by themselves. No. Remember, part of the dilemma we have is the old white guys writing about old white guys? Okay. What it should have said was, Adam and Phoebe Brown were the first settlers in 1834, and John and Sabra McCoy. But we got to reframe the history, so we're telling it in a full way, all right? But anyways, it's kind of cool that somehow, and I don't remember, but Isn't it that the Mooney people are not really quite sure where it came from, but they just got the plaque?
Yeah, a guy gave it to him, but that's actually the second plaque. I scanned most of Harriet and Ed's photographs.
Oh, there is, oh, they've got the earlier plaque here.
And there was an earlier plaque
Yes,
which was
I
stolen.
thought so.
They replaced it with that plaque, which is slightly different. It's worded differently. And that one was also stolen, so at that time, then they just decided to
That's
engrave
when
the
they
rock.
carved it in the rock because they kept losing the plaque. But anyways, again, that this is our history. This is our history right here. Then if you go on up to the corner of Sauk Trail and Vincennes Trace, Chicago Road, Dixie Highway, Route 1. This intersection, and just you go up the Forbidden Road. You just go up the Forbidden Road a couple miles, and this historically is one of the most important intersections in the history of Illinois. And there used to be, actually you can still see it in my photo. There used to be a little plaque there. The village of South Chicago Heights did a good thing and put up a little historic plaque. That plaque is gone. So they all get dispersed. Anyway, at the corner of what was the Sauk Trail, and it was originally Vincennes Trace, Hubbard's Trail, then it comes Route 1 and the Dixie Highway. Right at that intersection was the Brown Family Tavern. It was originally known as Brown's Corners. And there's actually a sign up there that says Brown's Corners. And their home, and they were related to the folks here in Crete, and we're pretty sure, I don't have total confirmation, but I'm very confident that freedom seekers found assistance here at that intersection. And then, of course, we have our congregational church right here, which many of us knew as the Antique Hall. Gratefully, now it has been obtained by the Crete Area Historical Society, and this is just a really important place. One of the congregations that ended up becoming the Crete Congregational Church was formed in 1839 in Beebe's Grove, which is where the Coles now is. And in 1841, that congregation was one of the very first congregations in the entire state of Illinois that issued a declaration, a resolution in opposition to slavery. It was Crete people who were among the very first in Illinois that officially said slavery is demonic and must go. And it happened right here. And that church is now being rehabbed, and some of you have seen this as they've been tearing it apart. And I just love this because, good Lord, that's the foundation, and they're tree trunks. And it's what some folks are doing on behalf of all of you is really terrific in terms of saving this church and saving this history. And I've committed to the Historical Society that when they are ready, I'm going to help them design a permanent Underground Railroad exhibit, because that's such an important part of your history. And so I will do right now a plug. This was not solicited, but I'll do it anyway. If you are not now, you should be a member of the Crete Area Historical Society. And no doubt you have some membership materials, right?
Yes, right on that table.
Right on that table.
Only
Right over there.
$20.
So, right after you buy one of my books, you join. All right.
Only
All right.
$20.
Only $20. Only $20 American to support your community. All right. One of the things that is really important for me about the church is that not only was it built by these families that were involved with the Underground Railroad, but also some of them are obviously they're still there. The family of Samuel and Elizabeth Cushing, and I'll say a word about them in a second, were very deeply involved, and here is the Cushing window, and I think there are 3 or 4 of the windows recognize families that were deeply involved in assisting freedom seekers, and that's why you have to keep your history, because all kinds of freedom seekers came right down these trails. And I think, we don't have any documentation yet, But I think, given that that church was built in 1853, I think that it is very, very probable that there were freedom seekers standing in that church and going to worship in that church in the 1850s. Now, this is your history right here. Now, both the church, I worked very closely with the leadership of the society, and several years ago, both the church and the cemetery next door were added to the National Park Service list of significant Underground Railroad sites. So you have a National Park Service designation, right here. And you can use, that cool little National Park Service seal, you can use that. That thing up there. You can put that on the side of the church if you want. So anyways, also there's the Samuel Elizabeth Cushing, and there are a number of these activist families are buried there in this congregation. And we have a wonderful cycle of stories and a lot of good historical evidence about a number of families right here in Crete that were directly involved in responding to the arrival of freedom seekers. One of the most significant of these was Samuel and Elizabeth Cushing, and in fact, in 1843, Sam was indicted by Will County and hauled off to Joliet. He was accused of assisting freedom seekers. And we've got all the details on the trial and everything like that. And bottom line is, the trial starts, and the judge says, and the jury, by the way, is packed with abolitionists, but the judge says, who's accusing Sam Cushing and Peter Stewart and a couple of who's accusing him? And it wasn't clear that anybody had the nerve to say anything, and the judge said, throw it out. And so they did not really. It's a much more complicated story, but that's the Cliff Notes. Now, where did the Cushings live? They lived right here. All right? And some of you may remember, a number of years ago, we started to talk to Coles and said, you really ought to put a historic marker on your parking lot that said, this is where Samuel Cushing was. And Samuel Cushing said, the evidence we have is that the Cushing family provided shelter for at least 90 freedom seekers coming through. Yeah.
I actually got all the pictures of that whole corner at home.
You've got the pictures, okay. Make sure the society gets them, and I want to see them.
They will be donated.
All right, and I want to see them too. Yeah, but can you imagine? I mean, when you go to the Coles, you're standing on history. And there were freedom seekers. At least 90 freedom seekers were right there. And then if you look across from this is the Coles parking lot on the left. If you look across, it's not that house, but that property is, over there is the property of the Beebe family and the Beach family, and they were also directly involved. And I'll be mentioning the Beebe family in a couple minutes. So anyway, the last thing I want to talk about, and then I'm going to ask Al to sing another song, and I'm going to tell you two stories, and then we're done. A bunch of us over the last year started asking, okay, we know a good deal about how people got to Chicago and how they got up here to Crete and Will County. And we know in general that they went on to Detroit and Freedom in Canada. But how did they go exactly? Where did the freedom seekers go? And so this has started a research adventure for me that has been just really remarkable for me. First of all, we know that the Sauk Trail went across, hundreds of years it's been there, from the Mississippi River, and went across Detroit and on to Canada. And native peoples moved back and forth on that trail. And we know that when freedom seekers came up into northeastern Illinois, one of the corridors they followed was the Sauk Trail corridor. We also know that in 1825, the federal government commissioned the building of a military road from Detroit to Chicago. And they started out and they were having real trouble, and one of the surveyors said, why don't we just follow the Indians? And so in fact, they located the Great Sauk Trail, and they just took the Chicago Road again along this indigenous trail that had been there for hundreds of years. So they took it all the way down here into LaPorte, and then they went up, and the original road to Chicago went along the beach. And they said in the early 1830s, if you made it to Michigan City, if the weather was perfect, the beaches were like a paved highway, and you could get to Chicago in 6 hours by stage. However, if the weather was not good, it took 6 days. And after a while, because that was so weird, they rerouted the great road from Detroit to Chicago inland. And that's the road that ends up coming into Chicago, up through Cal City and across the Little Calumet River and straight up into Chicago. And that's where Cornelius Kuiper and Jan Tun lived. Okay, so we know there are these two great historic roads that were followed by freedom seekers going east. In addition, a number of them traveled up, once they got toward Michigan, they traveled up to the great territorial road that was built by Michigan in the early 1830s and there were other combinations. And so as we were putting these together, we have initially designed a Chicago to Detroit freedom trail that starts in Chicago and goes all the way over to Detroit, following some of those historic highways. But because, remember the two streams? The stream of movement through Chicago and the stream of movement bypassing Chicago, we are designing the trail so that it has a second route that starts where? In Park Forest and Crete. And what we are designing is what we hope someday is going to be a federally designated National Historic Trail, and it starts right here. Okay, now, to look at some details, the Chicago route would start at the Quinn Chapel, a great historic black congregation in Chicago, which was very essential in the beginnings of the freedom seeker travels, and it comes down past the Tun Farm and into Illinois. The other one starts at the McCoy Homestead and starts with the permanent exhibit at our local museum. And so what we're looking at is in this direct area is recognize, first of all, the Great Sauk Trail right north of us. In addition, there was a historic post road that came down. Some of you will know it as Ridgeton Road. And of course, that comes right down past where the Coles is, the Tun Farm. Then there were other kind of connecting roads, and of course the great Vincennes Trace, Hubbard's Trail. And so what we see is beginning this branch of the Freedom Trail at the McCoy Homestead, coming south to the church and our permanent exhibit, and then going east to the Coles and the Cushing Farm, and then going up and connecting and then heading over into Indiana. And we have, and the people that I work closely with know this, we have got very good documentation on the McCoy Homestead, on the Batchelder Farm, what's the Cole Farm, the Brown Taverns. We need to do something about this intersection. I've got research to do on that. Of course, we've got the museum located here. We have the Stafford Farm. Now the, I'm drawing a blank. Theobald, right. Treebold. Then over here you've got the Moses Cook Farm, the Muirheads, the Cushing Farm, Coles, the Beach and BB Farm, and then we need to do some interpretation up on the Sauk Trail. This is all right here. This is what we need to develop together, and I think the Historical Society people are in for the long haul. I'm in for the long haul. I invite all of you, help us, because there's work to be done. Okay, now, what we're talking about then is the creation of a freedom trail that reaches out of Illinois and goes across. And in addition, we need to be looking at the historic Sauk Trail in Michigan. And I'm working with a bunch of folks in Indiana to create a northern Indiana freedom trail. So we've got a lot of really fun things happening. We've got volunteers all over the place that are working with us. We'd love to have your help. We're trying to build a national historic trail. The only national trail, almost all of them are in the West. The only national trail that is a part of African American history is the, obviously, justifiably, the Selma to Montgomery Trail. But what we're talking about is a great trail from Chicago to Detroit to commemorate the journeys of freedom seekers and to honor the people that responded to them, the white abolitionists and the black abolitionists all along the way. So, you may or may not know that our local school district, a workshop, high school teachers in Crete have developed a curriculum on the, you can see it's right down there, developed by Valerie Bruton and others by School District 201U. And this is now in the final developmental stages. There's a group in South Holland that has developed another curriculum. So we are getting the Illinois stories into Illinois schools, which we need. Now, I want to finish with two very short stories, and to get at that, I'd like to ask Al to come back up and sing a wonderful song about the water. And we'll be done soon because I want to have time to sign books and answer questions. Yes.
Thank you, Larry. Wade in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. Wade in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. See that band all dressed in red. God's gonna trouble the water. Well, it looks like the band that Moses led. God's gonna trouble the water. Wade in the water. Wade in the water, children. Wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water.
God's going to trouble the water. One of the remarkable stories of the Underground Railroad in Illinois is the story of Carolyn Quarles. You talk about traveling on the water. In 1843, Caroline was 16 years old. It's the only picture we have of her as an older woman. But she grew up enslaved in the Quarles household. Her father was her master's son, and her mother was a slave woman named Maria. Robert Quarles Jr. decided he was getting married, and he decided part of the fun of getting married was, let's rape some of the slaves. Caroline was the result. Maria was 17. Caroline grew up this beautiful young girl, pale skin, freckles, blue eyes, long black hair. She was enslaved. She grew up in a household with her free cousins. She grew up and they all played together, and they were free, and she was enslaved. And they could tell her what to do, and she had to do it. Finally, at age 16, she'd had enough. And she decided she was going to be a free human being. And she made use of the fact that she could pass. At age 16, she'd collected some money. She went down to the Mississippi River. They lived in downtown St. Louis. She went down to Mississippi, and she was able to buy a ticket on a riverboat going north. And so she got on the riverboat, and she mixed with some other young girls, and nobody noticed. And she took that riverboat all the way to Galena, Illinois.
Wow.
And the slave catchers already knew about her and were on her trail. And she got off the boat in Galena, and there's one black guy living in Galena. And he comes and says, "You're passing. We know about you. The slave catchers are on their way. You got to get out of town." So the guy puts her on the first stage out of town, which happens to go to Milwaukee. So she takes the stage in Milwaukee. She gets off, and once again, there's a black barber in the famous Wisconsin hotel in downtown Milwaukee. He looks out the window and he sees this girl get off the stage and runs out and said, "You're passing. You're in danger." And she's hidden for 3 weeks. And the abolitionists in Milwaukee have to figure out, what are they going to do with her? And finally, they agree that one of them will be her escort, and they will travel to get her to freedom in Canada. And so Caroline goes on this remarkable journey up the Mississippi River, across Milwaukee, comes down around Chicago, and makes her way to Detroit, and then freedom in Canada. And as she comes around Chicago, she comes down through Dundee and Naperville and Lockport, runs into some folks in Homer Township, hits the Sauk Trail in about New Lenox, and comes and stays for a while with the Beebe family in Beebe's Grove, across from where the Coles is. And she has a remarkable encounter with the church folks in Crete. And we know a great deal about her story. I've been able to uncover enough. We wrote a book about it. But can you imagine? 16 years old. She traveled 1,200 miles to be a free person. All right, she makes it to Canada and falls in love with a fellow named Alan Watkins. And Alan has escaped. He had been enslaved in Kentucky. He escaped, and Alan and Caroline fall in love, and they have a family. They have 6 children, and today their descendants live around the Detroit area on both the Canadian and the American side. And one of the joys of our travels, for Lil and for me, has been that we got to know Charlotte Watkins. This is Caroline's great-granddaughter. And Charlotte became a very special friend for us. A brilliant woman in her own right. She was a world-famous, Canadian-famous jazz singer for many years. She toured with jazz bands all over Europe. She had a full ride at Juilliard. And it's just a remarkable, kind of wonderful, brilliant woman that we got to know. And those are 2 of her grandchildren. And we, unfortunately, Charlotte passed about 2 years ago. But to meet Charlotte and to really learn from her the power of her family and the power of that courage, to make it to Canada and to find a way to make it. For those of you that know about the book that I've written, I co-wrote it with a woman named Kimberly Simmons, who was another descendant of Caroline, and that's Kimberly. The picture's from about 10 years ago. The Caroline and Alan Watkins were instrumental in starting the Sandwich Baptist Church, and the church still stands. And Sandwich is a village at the south edge of Windsor, Ontario. Okay? And interestingly, part of the dynamic in the 1840s was that Canada made it very clear that once you are in Canada, you are a free person, no exceptions. So if you made it there, fine. However, there were vigilante gangs in Detroit that would break the international law, and they would, sneak across into Canada. They would kidnap black families and bring them back to the United States and then sell them in the South. And so when they built the church in 1853, and Caroline and Alan helped to build it, they built a trap door inside the church so that on a Sunday morning, a lot of times the vigilantes would come because they knew that people gathered on Sunday mornings. And if the vigilantes came and were pounding on the door, if there were any recent fugitives, they'd hide them there, and then the women with their big dresses would stand on top of the thing, and they would protect the freedom seekers in the underways. One time we were there, and some of you may know that I've also have served as a pastor in various places. And I had one time we were there in Charlotte, visiting with Charlotte, and Charlotte played the music on Sunday mornings, and we got to church, and the minister, they had guest ministers, the minister had an accident and was delayed and wasn't there, and so Charlotte turned to the other people and said, well, Larry can preach. And so I had the amazing honor of preaching from the pulpit in the church that Caroline established, which was, kind of amazing. Caroline, 16 years old, decided that she would be a free human being. She traveled 1,200 miles. Her family, the Quarles, the White family, they were very proud of their Revolutionary War connections. Caroline's white grandfather and white granduncle served with George Washington at Valley Forge. And they were very proud. And Caroline grew up in a household enslaved, knowing that they were proud of their revolutionary heritage. So when Caroline decided in 1843 that she was going to declare her independence, what day did she leave? She left on the 4th of July. Okay, now, finally, John and Eliza Little. They traveled out of western Tennessee and made it to Canada. John and Eliza lived on adjoining farms in western Tennessee. And they met, fell in love, got married, but of course, as enslaved people, they couldn't live together. They lived on these adjoining farms. In 1841, they decided that if they were going to have any kind of life together, they had to be free. And so they plotted and schemed, and they gathered up a few possessions. And early in the spring, 1841, they snuck away in the middle of the night. And one of the things that's curious about the Tennessee River is that it comes out of the Appalachians, and then it goes straight north, up north through Tennessee and Kentucky to the Ohio River. So it is one of the very few rivers in America that flows north. But John and Eliza knew that to escape, they had to go downriver up north. Got it? All right. So they found the Tennessee and they went up. They got close to the Ohio. And there was a large swamp. And about 20 years later, John talked to some people and told them about this. And he said, we got to the swamp and we had to get across. And so I put Eliza on a log. And we had a couple possessions. I put them behind Eliza. And I pushed that log through the swamp. And I knew that if I made one misstep, I would lose all that I loved. And he pushed through that swamp. They got to the Ohio River, and they borrowed a boat, and they got across the river. And they were on the north side of the Ohio. They were a few miles from Cairo. And some other freedom seekers happened to come by and stopped, said at them at their fire. And these people were really tired and discouraged. John and Eliza were exhausted. They'd just gotten across the river, but they sat there, and these others started talking and said, we're close to Cairo. Why don't we just go back and we can turn ourselves in, and maybe our masters won't be too hard on us, but we can't do this. Eliza Little said, I know where we have been, and I know where we must go, and if need be, I will walk barefoot to Chicago for my freedom. John and Eliza Little walked 370 miles to get to Chicago. They found help from some black families. They made their way out. They got on a ship around the lakes, and got to Detroit. They had a remarkably good life living in Canada. But can you imagine? 16 years old, 1,200 miles to find your way to be a free person. John and Eliza, 370 miles of walking in places they did not know to be free. And what we have right here in Crete is we have all of these places to put our stick in the ground and say, it happened here. Caroline was right here, and talk to the Crete people right here. And John and Eliza Little made their way to Chicago. And hundreds of people came across on the Salt Trail, and that's our history. And that's what I keep trying to write about. So, thank you. So it is, thank you. It is 7:10. We have to be out of here at 7:45. But if you've got a couple questions, and then I'd be delighted to sell some books, and I'll sign them if you'd like. Any kind of questions? Just a couple questions. I didn't answer everything. Yes, sir.
Was there any standard way of helping people settle once they got to Canada? I mean, was there any help? Was there any,
Interesting question. There today in southwestern Ontario, that is in the area across from Detroit, there are 7 predominantly African Canadian communities, which are all the descendants of freedom seekers that made it to Canada. The experience in Canada was very mixed, as it is for people of color in this country. There were places that provided tremendous support. There were places that were downright discriminatory and ugly. There were a number of American church groups that set up systems to support people to help them resettle in Canada. So there was a wide range of things. And, think of it as, like a number of contemporary refugee situations. There are all kinds of official responses, and there are all kinds of unofficial charitable responses. But the people were, for the most part, able to get themselves settled without disaster. Yes, in the back.
Larry, considering the time in our history and stolen folks from Africa, there was no GPS, no maps. How did they figure out which way to go, whatever, going north?
Right. How did people get north?
how did they figure out which way to go?
Right. Well, first of all, there was much more communication among plantations and across Southern society than we really give credit to. So there were people talked a lot with one another. Part of the uniqueness for Illinois was that up the Mississippi River Valley, there was a very rich kind of common culture. There were French people and Spanish people and Native American people and free black people and enslaved people, and all in this very rich kind of river culture up and down the Mississippi from New Orleans all the way up above St. Louis And the evidence that we're now uncovering is that within that culture, people really talk to each other an awful lot. And so it appears that a lot of information got relayed into plantations and farms about where to go. So there was an overwhelming, from the very beginning, there was a clear sense to head north, but fairly soon in the 1830s, Chicago was identified as a kind of sanctuary city. And so, and if you follow the Mississippi River, you follow the Illinois River, you'll get to Chicago. And so there was a lot of informal information sharing. We also now have evidence that there were some fairly simple but effective maps that were circulated, showing, follow the rivers and get yourself north. So and I think that we also need to honor the kind of the courage and the tenacity of people that were running, that they knew they had to go north and they do whatever was necessary. We've got stories of people that end up going in circles before they finally got north. But a lot of information was in the air. Some of it was written down, but people found their way. Even those traveling independently got help. And we know that in Illinois particularly, once you got past Springfield, once you were into northern Illinois, the word was that you were relatively safe. If you were traveling, you had to be discreet, but you could travel during the day. Prior to that, travel was all at nighttime. But once they got north of Springfield, you could travel during the day, and you could make inquiries, and you would not, you don't go talk to the sheriff, but you could be fairly safe. So there was a lot of, if you will, information in the air. Yeah.
How far east has anyone gone to do history on the trail? I know you talked about New Lenox. Is New Lenox thinking about doing the same thing? Have they communicated with you?
Well, I've worked with folks across the state over the years. What we're looking at for the National Historic Trail, I'll try to answer your question. If I don't, let me know. We're looking at the National Historic Trail was we really needed to have a starting point. So Cook County, Will County is kind of the starting point. Now, a bunch of people are working on what happened in Illinois. The state legislature has just created the Illinois State Underground Railroad Task Force, which will start in January 1st. I've been appointed to the task force and people around the state. And part of what we're going to be doing is looking at the trails and the pathways and the patterns within the state of Illinois. Because as I've shown you on my maps, I've got some pretty good idea about the patterns, but we have a lot of research we have to put together. So there are a bunch of people, and for example, the New Lenox people and the Joliet people both connect to our story, but also they connect to the Chicago story. Is that, Yes, in the back?
So while all of this was happening with the Underground Railroad, so you had the indigenous people who were simultaneously going as things were happening at the same time. So do you have any connection between indigenous America and the Underground Railroad and what was happening?
Great connection, great question. Is there a connection between indigenous people and the Underground Railroad? Okay, bear in mind that in Illinois and for the most part in Indiana, the indigenous people are forced out in the early 1830s. And so although there were indigenous people that stayed around, overwhelmingly it had become an Anglo environment. The interesting question is, were there connections with the indigenous people prior to that or in the West? A great deal of research has been done in the western states, and there clearly were a number of black individuals and families that settled in the West as fugitives, living with native peoples. I found only one story so far, but it's a terrific story about a guy named Black Bob, who was a freedom seeker, settles with the Potawatomi, marries a Potawatomi woman, lives in western Will County. And all of those stories, the history stories, say that permanent American settlement happens in the late 1820s with a guy named the Reverend Jesse Walker, who was very successful in dealing with the Indians and brought white people to settle. Well, what I uncovered was the fact the reason Reverend Walker was successful was because he employed Black Bob. And Black Bob was his translator, and he knew all the Potawatomi people, and he'd been there for years. And so it's like talking about DuSable. You know, the first white person in Chicago is DuSable, who's not a white guy. And in the south suburbs, the first permanent white settler is not a white man, it's Black Bob. So we know that connection. A friend of mine at the University of Denver, the University of Detroit, Mercy College, is doing deep research now on the connections with indigenous people. And he is finding some very exciting things. And it's a whole new area that you're pointing to. But he has already uncovered some evidence, very good evidence of freedom seekers coming up the Mississippi to the Rock River, you know, Rockford, over on the Rock Island, I'm sorry, Rock Island, coming and settling with Potawatomi and Sauk villages. And, you know, and that's just really exciting stuff I'd never seen. So there are people that are beginning to dig seriously into your exact question. And I think that's very exciting because, you know, it's like we've always got to be pushing back because we think things started at a point we discover, no, it started earlier, and it started earlier, and it started earlier. Okay, thank you all very much. I'd be delighted to come talk to Will and I. And we'll talk again. Thank you.